I don't know about you, but I'm getting sick of all these laws. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but I preferred life in the Stone Age. There were no laws in those days. The only things to worry about were Neanderthals and woolly mammoths. But now things are different. Woolly mammoth are no longer woolly, they're just kind of grey. And Neanderthals aren't called Neanderthals anymore, they're called Russians. But there are some places in the world today with no laws. These lawless areas of the modern world are like the Old West, just with less Native Americans. But they're still interesting and I think you should know about them. Libya. The country once ruled by a long-lost Muppets character is now a hot mess. Under the rule of their insane dictator, Libya was actually doing quite well. Education was free even for girls. In fact, Libyan women had far more rights than other Arab states. Poverty was also relatively low. Libyan society was comparatively great, but Gaddafi was still a dictator, and as part of the Arab Spring he was overthrown and killed. With the dictator dead, rebel forces splintered into different groups, many of which claimed to be the legitimate government. Libya descended into lawlessness, with different parts of the country controlled by different armed groups. There are thought to be around 1,700 active armed groups in Libya. There's no government or police force or courts to stop them or anyone else doing whatever they want. In some areas, the slave trade has made a comeback, which is never a sign things are going great. Libya is a failed state now, a lawless desertous wasteland like something from a low-budget Australian sci-fi movie. And in the chaos, many Libyans miss the crazy waxwork figure-looking sex bomb they chased out of office. Jerusalem is an interesting city for many reasons, one of which is because the city is split in half, with the west under Israeli control and the east under Palestinian control. This makes life very confusing for people who live in a neighborhood called Ras Hamis. The neighborhood is claimed by Israel as their territory, but it is separated from the rest of Israeli Jerusalem by the concrete wall erected by Israel a decade ago. And so the only way to access or leave Ras Hamis is to pass through Palestinian land. This has left the neighborhood an isolated no man's land in a sort of legal limbo. The mayor of Jerusalem said Ras Hamis should not be considered part of the city, leaving people to wonder who actually owns the land. Some argue that, in theory, no one does. There's no sign of any authority in Ras Hamis, causing residents to pave their own roads. It's a lawless never zone in the middle of Jerusalem, but with a population over 20,000, massive skyscrapers have sprung up. Luckily, they don't need planning permission. Unluckily, people can get away with murder. It's a glass half full thing. Pakistan is the country that gave us Pakistanis. It's a vast country with some areas being relatively safe and others being incredibly dangerous. Along Pakistan's border with Afghanistan is a region known as Fatah, a notorious frontier where local tribes make their own laws and do whatever they like. Technically speaking, Pakistani law is meant to apply here, but their lack of control over the area means their laws essentially don't exist. The problem is, having a lawless region in this part of the world attracts terrorist groups like Scandinavian landmarks attract Chinese tourists. So the Pakistani government has decided to retake control of the area and merge its territory with the province bordering it. They are currently in the process of doing this, so the lawless frontier might not be lawless for much longer, but much of the neighbouring Afghanistan will almost certainly remain virtually lawless for decades. Mexico is in a difficult position. Since 2006, the government has been at war with drug cartels. With billions of dollars at stake, the cartels didn't give up easily. After high-profile leaders were arrested, the drug war became ever more violent. Thousands of police have been killed, entire cartels have risen and fallen, and some Mexican soldiers even switched side. Corruption came with the violence, and one town in central Mexico has had enough of it. Arming themselves, they drove known criminals out of the town, but they didn't stop there, also throwing out politicians and police. That was in 2011, and for the last 7 years the town has governed itself. They set up a new political system without a mayor, and a civil militia instead of police. As it resulted in one of Mexico's lowest homicide rates, the government is letting Tehran run itself. So I guess they just kind of make their own laws now. One of which is a ban on any kind of political advertisement, because they still hate politicians. African border disputes have been a reoccurring problem in all our lives, but we have nothing on the leaders of Egypt and Sudan. Both countries were once part of the British Empire, and the Brits drew a border between them in 1899, but the border was just a random straight line for some reason. Drawing borders is difficult. You have to take into account the peoples who live in surrounding areas and which culture they belong to. So in 1902 the British were forced to redraw the border like this. In theory, this would make things better. The problem is, when it came time for their independence, each nation recognized a different border. This coastal triangle is incredibly valuable, so both Egypt and Sudan claim it. To support that claim, neither side claimed this small patch of land. In fact, no country claims it, making it the only place on Earth that is habitable but not claimed by any government. International law considers it terra nullius. With no government, there are no laws, so if you want to commit a crime, head to this 800 square mile nobody's land. You could also go to Norway because they have quite cushy prisons, but the Scandinavian winters are dreadful, so Bir Tawil is a better option. The area has no permanent residents, but last year an Indian man went there and declared himself king of Bir Tawil. He had his own flag, so you know it's legit. Yet his claim has not been recognized and Bir Tawil remains a lawless nobody's land. Ever since Joseph Stalin invented space, people have been asking a very simple question: who actually owns space? Well, in the 1960s, that question was answered. A treaty signed by 107 countries dictates that no government can claim any area of space or any celestial body. To put it simply, no one owns space, and no nation's laws can apply on other planets. So what would happen if someone were to commit a crime while on the moon? Well, in theory, they would be arrested and charged on arriving back on Earth, but you might be able to argue innocence on account of space being lawless. The truth is, we can't say for certain, as it's uncharted territory from a legal standpoint. Just 536 people have been to space, and as far as I'm aware, none of them have committed any serious crime. They just don't seem like a bad group of people. Apart from Buzz Aldrin, I don't trust that man. He has the eyes of a coyote, a bloodthirsty, rabid coyote. If he had murdered Neil Armstrong in space, he may well have been arrested back on Earth, but being charged with a crime on Earth doesn't necessarily mean that there are any laws in space. One of our world's most interesting places is Western Sahara, a large disputed territory on the west coast of North Africa. This 103 square mile desert is home to just 500,000 people, making it one of Africa's most sparsely populated regions. Until 1975, it was an overseas territory of Spain. When Spain withdrew, multiple countries claimed ownership of Western Sahara. Today, most of the territory is controlled by Morocco, but being such a sparsely populated wasteland, 25% of Western Sahara isn't controlled by Morocco or any other country. It is home to a self-proclaimed country, the Sahrawi Republic, but few other nations recognize it as a real country. It's completely isolated by a wall built by Morocco. On one side of the wall is land administered by Morocco. It's hard to say what's on the other side. Access is difficult due to landmines from the war, and a complete lack of civilization. Most of the people you would see there are nomads, constantly on the move. That's if you actually see any humans. It's about as lawless as anywhere could be, and a place few people outside of North Africa have witnessed, or even heard of. Before Libya descended into chaos, another African state gave a glimpse of what was to come. Until 1991, Somalia was ruled as a military dictatorship, but then its government was overthrown by a coalition of rebel groups. Just like in Libya, these groups then competed with each other for power. Different groups took control of different areas and Somalia was torn apart. That civil war is still ongoing today. Realistically, Somalia is a collection of territories rather than a functioning country. Some are controlled by the government. Some are controlled by various warlords. As you'd expect, much of Somalia is a lawless anarchy, allowing rebels to grow strong on land and pirates to flourish at sea. It's got to the point where the only safe part of Somalia sort of isn't part of Somalia. It's called Somaliland. When the government fell in 1991, it declared independence from Somalia. Since then, it has existed as a de facto separate country. Somaliland seems to be one of the only places in what was once Somalia that isn't completely lawless. Countries with access to the coast usually own the waters that stretch 12 miles from that coast. They have sovereignty within those 12 miles, but outside of that is international waters. No country has jurisdiction over international waters, meaning it is, in a sense, lawless. If a crime is committed on international waters, the country with which the ship is registered will be responsible for dealing with it. In a lot of cases that does happen, but in reality countries like Somalia are unable to bring pirates to justice. And the high seas are so vast they can't possibly be observed or controlled. That's why so many of the world's shipping lines are vulnerable to piracy even today. But it's not just pirates who take refuge on the seas. In the 1960s, the BBC held a monopoly on British radio waves, making it almost impossible for independent broadcasters to compete. To combat this, some radio stations mounted their gear onto a boat, sailed into international waters, and broadcast whatever they liked, knowing British law could do nothing to stop them. That's where the term pirate radio comes from. The Suez Canal has long been one of the world's most vital shipping routes, giving Europeans a shortcut to Asia, instead of having to sail around Africa. The canal is surrounded on both sides by Egypt, but that all changed in 1967. It was in June of that year Egypt went to war with Israel. In a matter of days, Israel captured all of Egypt's territory east of the canal. To stop Israel having equal access to the canal, Egypt closed it, demolishing bridges and deploying powerful mines. Making things more dramatic, 15 ships were crossing the canal on the day it was closed, trapping them inside. For 8 years they were trapped on the canal, unable to leave. The crews of each ship moored to the others, forming a small island. Despite being different nationalities, the crews built a society together, with a church service, social clubs and even a post office. In the middle of disputed waters and a conflict zone, the outside world had left them behind, but they basically established their own tiny country, a floating city-state where they could live by their own rules. For 8 years they survived in this lawless condition. As wind covered the ships in sand, it came to be known as the Yellow Fleet. By 1975, Israel had returned the lost lands to Egypt and the canal was reopened. After all those years of being stranded, only 2 of the ships were able to sail home. They reached Germany in May, being greeted by a massive cheering crowd. Of course, this place with no laws no longer exists. In fact, it hasn't since 1975. But I felt the narrative of Yellow Fleet is too interesting a story not to include. It is one of the most incredible stories of survival in human history, but one that has largely been forgotten. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I just wanted to let you know the best place to get extra content from me is on Instagram, where I post daily facts. Facts like this. In Hong Kong, 1 in 7 people are millionaires. That sounds made up, but it's actually true. So for interesting facts like this every day, follow me on Instagram at Escafy Media.